Today we are going to discuss about the trigger framework and minimal trigger framework, all those things. Everyone knows already trigger, why we use the trigger, all those things. So we are going to see about what is the best way to write the trigger. I will first explain with the normal structure that we are following currently. So we will have the trigger and the trigger name, and we will have the object, and we will have the events defined. Inside that, we will be checking what kind of event occurred. Then we will be calling the trigger handler methods and trigger handler class and the particular method from the trigger handler class. So this trigger is written on the time sheet, and there is a time sheet trigger handler, and we have separate methods for each type of event. Like before update we have separate method, before delete we have the separate method, and we are passing the trigger context variable from the trigger to trigger handler classes. And inside the trigger handler class event methods, we will be having the logic to execute, and sometimes we may also call some other class from this trigger handler class. So in this case, from the trigger handler we are calling the trigger helper, and here we are having some operations. So with this time sheet trigger is having the two functionalities. So one is update is spent effort for task. So whenever the time sheet effort is updated, it is updating the total spent effort field in the task. So since the time sheet and the task is not the master detail relationship, it is done by the code. So you guys already aware this project task object, and we have the time sheet object. And so whenever we update the spent effort in the time sheet, it will be reflected in the total spent effort in the task. So this is the one of the functionality that we have. So for that, from trigger we are calling the trigger handler. From trigger handler we are calling the trigger helper in the after insert and update methods. So this is the two method. From this two method we are calling the trigger helper. So this is the one functionality. So another functionality we have is we have the validation. In the task object, there is one field called payment status. So if the payment status is invoiced, then we should not allow the timesheet to update. So for that, we are having the validation in the code. So same, it is coming from the trigger handler to the trigger helper, and we have the method in the trigger helper, and it checks and it throws the error message. So this is the current functionality of the trigger. We have the trigger, and from the trigger we are updating the parent object, which is task, and also we are throwing the error message. This is the two logic or business use case that we are achieving currently. I think most of you guys are using this framework currently. We can even write the logic inside the trigger, but that is not good. So we are following this approach. So we have separate trigger handler, and we are calling that. So there are some disadvantages when we are using the trigger framework in this way. So one of the thing is trigger is having more code. Like here we are checking for the event, and we are calling the trigger handler methods and events. So that in trigger we are having lot of codes. So the next thing is okay. And currently, like if we missed to add any event methods, and if we identify later, that time we need to modify the trigger code. So that is one disadvantage is there. And okay, so we don't need this code itself when we are going with the different framework. And there is no bypass mechanism currently. For example, from the time sheet, we are updating the task trigger. After we update the task, it should not trigger the task related handlers. Means it should not trigger the task related trigger and handler. There is no option to bypass that if we need to bypass in this approach, in the current approach. And for handling the recursive logic, we need to have the logic for the each trigger. For each trigger, we need to introduce the recursive logic handling. So that is one more disadvantage. And we need, if there is any logic which is common to many object trigger, that we need to repeat it in the current structure. So whatever the recent disadvantage I explained now, it might not be clear for you guys. So I will start with the next framework approach. That time it will be clear. So what I have done is I have created the same set of trigger again, but called as minimal trigger. So in the trigger, if you guys say, we can add all the events. So whatever the events we have, we can add all the events, and we will be just calling the trigger handler run method. So we won't be checking whether it is before insert and after insert and calling the certain event-based method from the handler. We will just call a handler class with run method. That's it. So once you create the trigger, there is no more changes needed for the trigger. It will be clean. You will not be making any changes on the trigger later after that. So next, when you look at the trigger handler, so this is the trigger handler, and if you see this it is extending the base trigger handler method. So what we need to do in the Salesforce org, we need to create on base trigger handler method. So this you can easily get it from the GitHub. I will be sharing this GitHub link. So if you go to the SRC, you can see the two files. One is trigger handler class and the trigger handler test class. So these two class we need to install in the org where we are writing the trigger. Either you can install it from GitHub directly, or you can copy paste and you can create it via the Visual Studio Code. So if you guys see, this is the virtual class and this is the trigger handler class. So for whatever the object we are creating the trigger handler, we will be extending this class. So the benefit is whatever the logic we are having in the trigger handler, same can be utilized in the other trigger handler methods across the different objects. So we don't need to repeat the logic. So I will come to the point to explain what is repeating logic, all those things. So for now, you guys just remember we need to create this base trigger handler and trigger handler test class in the Salesforce org. So after that, what we need to do is when we are creating the trigger handler for the particular method, we need to extend the base trigger handler. So this is the virtual class and we are extending that. Okay. So this is the first step. So the second thing is, this is the trigger handler constructor class. Here we need to load all the trigger context variable into the local variable. So in the trigger handler, we will be creating all the trigger context variable, local variable to store. So all of these are private, and here like new TS map, old TS map, like that I have created the local variable for storing the trigger context variable. So in the constructor method, we need to load all of those things. So we need to load all the trigger context variable into the local variable. So if you see the old framework, we need to pass this trigger context variable from the trigger to trigger handler one by one. But here it's not the case. We just need to call the run method and it will be automatically fetched and it will be loaded here. The one thing you need to remember, this trigger.newMap will be at the SObject data type when we are using this virtual class extension. So we need to convert that to the specific SObject type and we need to store it in our local variable. For others, it is fine. Like for Boolean and all, it's already Boolean only, so we are directly loading. So these are the local variable and we are loading all the trigger context variable into the local variable. So the code looks simple. There is no passing from the trigger to trigger handler. So the next thing is we need to have the methods, right, to identify what kind of events occurred and when to execute the certain actions. So these all the events before insert, before update. So these all the things, usually what we will do, we will check in the trigger what kind of event is occurred and we will be calling the trigger handler. But in this case, we don't need to do that. We just need to override it. So these methods are already available in the base trigger handler and it is taking care of that job of identifying which event is occurred. So we just need to override that method. So these are the default method we can override before insert, before update, before delete, after insert, like that. So all these methods are same. If you see, we are not getting any variables, so any arguments we are getting it because it's already we got from the constructor and we stored in the local variable. There is no passing from the trigger to trigger handler. So this method looks neat without any variables. We have all these methods. So we have our local variables and we have our methods to find out which event has occurred. So next we can go with the logic. So when we are going with the logic, we need to thoroughly think how to have that logic. So the first thing is, okay, so first what we are doing, we are calculating time log total effort and we are storing in the tasks total spent effort field. Okay, so when we have the use case, we need to decide whether we need to have the method inside the handler or we need to have the separate class that we need to call from the handler. So for this, use case, what is the good idea? Whether we can go with the handler method that we can have inside this handler class, or do we need to have the separate class that can be called from the handler class to that separate specific class? Anyone have any idea for this use case? What will be the appropriate and why?
Handler method means this handler method, like trigger handler minimal.
Yeah, inside the trigger handler, we can have one more method, and that we can call from the this overriding methods.
No, we can go
Instead of
with
calling
this
the
separate specific class.
okay. So what is the decision point? So why you decided to go with the separate class?
Maybe in future, if we have enhancement in that particular related to calculating time log based upon the task, so we can make changes and deploy that only.
Okay, so what enhancement do you think related to, because it's already calculating the total effort and storing it. Maybe we can add some more filters. That's it. Other than that, I don't see any enhancement.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. So there are few things you guys need to think when coming to this decision. So one thing is whether this logic is specific to this trigger or it is generic to any generic logic. Okay, whether it is specific to this trigger or it is generic logic, that we need to think one. So I will go in detail. First, let me write down the points. Later, I will explain in detail. One is whether it is specific to this particular time seat object trigger or it is generic. So the next thing is complexity. So how complex this is, whether it will be finished with the less number of lines or it can have lot of more lines. So next thing is scalability. So currently it may look simple, like it can be done with the 5-10 lines, simple logic, but in the future it can expand. So the scalability we need to think. Okay, so let's keep this 3 point and let's decide where we can put this. Okay, so one is specific or generic. So what we are doing is for the each task we are calculating the total spent effort. Okay, so currently we are triggering this from the time sheet. Whenever time sheet is modified, we are updating the total spent effort. Okay, so whether this logic is specific to only time sheet trigger or this logic can be executed from somewhere else as well. So this is like role of logic. There is a chance we may need to process some old records or we may need to do some bulk updates. So we can't tell it's always we need to call from the time sheet trigger. We may need to call this class separately also. Like under a single project, we came to know like a task total spent effort is not updated correctly. So that time what we can do, we can pass all the task ID to recalculate the total spent effort. Okay, so this can be called from anonymous window as well. If like for old records, if something is happened, but mostly it falls under the time sheet trigger. But in some cases, we may need to call from the anonymous window also for processing the past records. Like if client is coming now and telling to implement this logic, but there is already task and time sheet is there. So if we added this logic inside the handler method, it can be a bit difficult because we may need to pass the time sheet IDs so instead of task IDs or project IDs. So those things may happen. So we can't completely tell it is generic logic, but it is partial. Okay. But when we okay, so let's keep with this. Next, complexity. So for calculating the total spent effort, it needs some more line of code. It will not complete with like 5-10 lines of code. So it's definitely more lines. So if you are putting this inside the handler method, it's going to take a lot of space. So it's not good. So it's more lines and it's complexity. So next thing is scalability. So when coming to the scalability, we need to think in the broader level. Like what I told, like now it can have less number of lines, but later it can have more lines also. So currently we are calculating the task total spent effort. Later client may tell to roll up another one field in the task. Maybe they may ask what is the task total meeting effort, task total learning effort. If they come up with that scenario, then we can't keep adding method inside the handler, right? But if you're having one generic class that is called task roll-up manager or something, so inside that we can add all the roll-up related logics. So it's very easy when we get to the new requirement, we can easily append in that class. Okay, so scalability is definitely there. So if anyone is coming, then definitely we need to go with the specific class instead of the handler method. So going with the specific class, if you are taking the decision, it's fine. But if you are taking the decision with going with the handler method, you need to think twice, because handler method can be overloaded with a lot of lines of code. Okay, so taking the decision with the specific class is easy. Even if you take the decision, there won't be any issues later. But taking the decision of going to the handler method, we need to think and take it. So any doubts here?
So adding errors or any validation, we can do that in handler itself. Any small logics like adding error and validation.
Yeah, so adding error, like if you're checking some validation on the timesheet record, it is definitely specific. Okay, let's put it, same logic, let's apply. Like if you're, we discussed it, right, that invoiced, when timesheet is invoiced, sorry, when task is invoiced, if people are trying to edit the timesheet, then we need to throw the error message on the timesheet record. So it is specific to the particular object. So it's definitely specific. And complexity, it's definitely very less number of lines. We just need to check on filter and we need to throw the error message. That's it. So very less number of lines. And the scalability, okay, so the here coming to the point. So now if you are implementing only one validation error message, that's fine. But if client is gave some 5-10 error message, but that you can't achieve with the validation role. You need to add all 5-10 in the Apex class only. So that time you need to create on generic specific class called timesheet validator something, and you need to put everything there. If there is only one validation that you need to check, that time it's fine. You can maintain in the trigger handler class only.
Yeah, okay.
Got it?
It's got it.
So when you guys get the requirement or logic, you always need to think at the broader level. What will be the next? What client may ask next? To what extent this feature can go? So that kind of mentality you guys need to have in the mind. The scalability is very, very important. Okay. So if particular logic or code can scale, then definitely it should be in the format of readable and maintainable. Okay. Otherwise, it becomes difficult. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so before what we did, we created the helper class and we created separate method, but still even this helper looks more generic. It's not in easily readable format. So what I did is I moved the pent effort logic to the task role of manager separate class. If you see this line, it is having like 64 lines of code. See how this will look if we are putting this in the handler class. Okay, so it's not readable and maintainable. So we need to put it in the separate class. So what I am doing is here I am getting all the task ID and calculating the fetching the timesheet record and calculating. Also, you guys need to be very careful what arguments you are passing, what argument or what parameters you are passing when something is happening. Here, if you see, I am not passing the time log ID to this task role of manager, timesheet ID. Trigger is on the timesheet, but I am not passing the timesheet. I am passing task ID. Why I am passing the task ID? Because this class can be generic. Even I can run this from the anonymous window. I can pass some 3-4 task ID and tell this class to update the task with the right spent effort. Okay, so instead of that, what I am doing is here I am calling the calculate total spent effort method. Inside this only I am calling on method. So from this method, what I am doing, I am fetching all the task ID and then I am calling the another class. So from the override method, I am calling the handler method, which is having around 10 lines of code. This is doing all the pre-processing that is required for another class. Okay, so I am not doing the pre-processing in this generic class. I am doing the pre-processing before passing to the generic class. So here I am checking is updated, delete all those things, and I am adding into the task ID and sending it. So, and one more important thing, when you guys are writing the trigger, you make sure you are adding all the events. So you need to add all the events and you need to decide for your logic each event is needed or not. Because most of the time this is happening. We just focus on insert and update. We are not focusing on delete and undelete. So a lot of errors are happening due to that. So you need to make sure your logic is getting executed for all the 7 events. Okay, that is important. So next thing is for validating, I am calling the method from the override method, override event method, I am calling the handler method. Here I'm just checking if the task is invoiced, then I am adding the error method. So it's just like 5-10 lines of code. It's fine if it is having here, instead of creating one more class and putting the logic there. Definitely, like if there is, we need to throw some 10 errors like this, that time we need to go with the separate class. We can call that as timesheet validator, something like that, and we can maintain that in the separate class. So your code needs to look very neat and clean. You need to be proud of that. So that mentality should be there. So when the code looks clean and organized, you will be encouraged to work. Like it's same like how we keep our place clean and organized. It keeps our mind clean and more active. Okay, so that's important. Okay, so any doubts so far?
Nothing.
Okay, so and next thing is naming conventions. So you guys need to make sure you are putting the correct naming conventions. I think you already know for variables we need to use the camel case, and for the trigger names we need to use the Pascal case. And that variable name also, it should be meaningful. Like since it is new, I get a new, and TS is the short form of the timesheet and the map. So like that, we need to keep the meaningful names. So by seeing the name only, we should be able to know like what this variable is doing, what for what it is used, all those things. So next, again, let's go back to comparing the. So actually, this is also minimal trigger framework only, but this is not virtual extended. It's just a simple minimal trigger framework. But what I named minimal is this virtual trigger handler extended version. So for any trigger you guys are creating going forward newly, you need to use this virtual trigger framework only. Okay, so you keep that practice going forward. Okay, so I was telling about the bypass, right? For example, here if you can see, this is the opportunity trigger handler. They extended the base trigger handler and they created the opportunity trigger handler. Inside the opportunity trigger handler, see, inside this event method only they added the logic, but we will not be doing that. Okay, so we will not be doing that. We won't be putting our logic inside the event method only. We will be putting in the separate method. So when we see the event method, it should look clean. We should not see any logic here. We should be having only method names. So here what they are doing, they are querying the opportunity, and they are querying all the account related to the opportunity, and they are updating the account. So here what will happen when they are updating the account, normally what will happen, it will fire the account trigger. So we are inside the opportunity trigger, we are updating the account, it will fire the account trigger and account trigger handler. This is how it will happen. But in some scenario or logic, we don't want to execute the other handlers. Okay, even in the roll up, I think we don't need to execute the other classes. Like from the timesheet we are updating the task, but that there is no need that again it can trigger the task trigger handler. It will just run the trigger unwantedly. So in those things, what we can do, we can bypass. So in the trigger handler base method, there is in the trigger handler base class, there is one method called the bypass. So from there we can to this we can pass the handler method name. So when we do this, this line tells the trigger handler that don't execute the account trigger handler. After this, whatever is happening after this line of code, don't execute the account trigger handler. It is telling to the trigger handler base class. Okay, so here we are updating the name and we are updating the account. So usually in the normal way, this will call the account trigger will call the account trigger handler. But since we added this line, bypass line, it will not call the account trigger handler. It just updated the account, that's it, done. It will not call associated account trigger and account trigger handler. Okay, so this is actually in many scenario we may need this logic. We may need to bypass the unwanted calling of the other trigger. Okay, and after certain line of number, if you want to clear that bypass, you can clear. Okay, so they are clearing this and they are doing update here again. So here when they do update here, it will not call the account trigger handler, but when they do the update here, it will call the account trigger handler, because here before this line they added the clear bypass. So we can without this approach also we can do what we need to do. Inside the account trigger handler, we may need to have some label or something. Based on that, we need to check true or false. Those things and all we need to do. But this is simple. And also this bypass method, we don't need to have it for separate object specific handler. That this logic is already written inside the trigger handler generic base class. You can just use this at the any trigger handler, which is extended with the base trigger handler. So any doubts here?
No, Tamil, it's clear.
Yeah, one thing, Tamil, it's when this one is bypassed in this code, at the same time, the trigger happened through account object also will not work, right?
No. This is specific to this transaction.
Okay. So because that also account trigger handler also called through that account trigger, in handler only they are bypassing it. And the same time that variable is set to false or something through this trigger handler.
No, that will be in the different transaction, right? In the different transaction, that variable won't be set to the false or something.
Okay, got it.
So this transaction is initiated from the opportunity. This is going in one thread.
Yeah, got it.
Whatever update is happening, that is in the different thread. That will not affect this. So like this issue where it will happen, we are controlling, if we are controlling manually from the custom label or metadata type, that time this issue can happen. But in this with this approach, that issue will not occur.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you show what happens in bypass method? Trigger handler dot bypass.
Okay.
No, what happens there?
Yeah, I will open the base trigger handler. So first they are adding in the trigger handler base class, they are calling the bypass trigger handlers. So that whatever we are passing, that they will be adding it. So what happens when we are calling the run method, right? We will be calling the run method from the time set trigger handler. So here we are calling, right? So when we are calling the run method, it will hit the trigger handler run method. There it will check if there any bypass handler is added previously for this trigger. If it is added, it will not execute that. It will not go to this class. Otherwise, it will execute this class. Hello? Shankar, you are on mute.
Yeah. No, I didn't get
So basically, all the control is on the trigger handler since we extending that. Okay. So when we are calling the trigger handler run method, it will not only execute this handler, it will execute this trigger handler class also. So in the trigger handler class, we already told bypass this trigger handler. So it will not execute this complete class only.
Okay, what Jagan asked, what happens if two transaction occurs at the same time?
Yeah, that's what I'm telling now. Whatever is happening, it's context to that particular transaction, right? That's how all other logics also works. So it works. It's applicable for only that transaction. When other transaction runs, it is separate thread. In other transaction also, if you are executing this line number, then that also will be bypassed. Okay. But in other transaction, if that transaction is not coming to this part of code only, but still it is updating the account, that time it will be executed. Okay. So basically, it is safe to use since it is specific to the particular transaction and not for all the transactions. Okay. So we can even check if this account trigger handler is bypassed. If it is bypassed doing something, all those things we can do it. So next thing is this is max loop count. So we can set each handler how many times it can execute. So like if we call this set max loop count to 1, this will execute opportunity trigger handler only once. In the same transaction, if opportunity trigger handler is getting executed at the second time, it will not execute. So that logic also we can have it. So all these logics are defined in the trigger handler. So I will also show you how the upgraded version of the trigger handler will look like. So basically what you will do, whatever the logic you think it is common to all the trigger objects, that logic you can add inside the base trigger handler. Okay. So currently this is having like around 240 line of code, but I will show you one other client code of base trigger handler method. How much line of code it is having and what logic they have it in the comment. So it will it will be more knowledge for you. So other than the existing logic, you can keep adding more logic inside this base trigger handler. So whatever the method you are adding inside the base trigger handler, it is applicable to the all the objects. So this is 140 line of code. So if you see the client org, it is having 380 lines of code. So it means they added some more logic on top of it. So one of the main logic they added is that is easily understandable for you guys. Okay. So when the before delete is getting executed, they are calling the deletion validation method. So let's assume, so you are working for one company, what they are asking, they should be able to delete the record only if they have one custom permission. Even though they have delete permission in the permission set or profile, we need to have one more check. We also need to go in the custom permission and check whether they are having delete permission. Okay. So this, if they ask for one specific object, you can directly write it in the trigger handler, specific object trigger handler method. But since they asked this for all the object, this is specific to the all the handler, right? All the object handler, all the object trigger. So that's why this logic is added in the trigger base trigger handler. So this logic will be executed for the any trigger handler. You don't need to do anything. It will get executed automatically. So what they are doing, they are checking is deletion allowed. How they are checking? Based on permission. They are checking if it is having, if the user is having the custom permission. If they are having that permission, then only, if they are not having the permission, then it will throw the exception. Then deletion will be stopped. So this will get executed for any object, account, contact, lead, any object. Like today, a client is coming and telling to add the deletion for the account, but tomorrow he is coming for the contact. You don't need to do for separately. If you add that logic in the trigger handler, then it is common to all the objects. It's clear? Hello?
Yes,
It's clear. Okay. So with the virtual extended minimal trigger framework, the advantage is code looks neat in the trigger, code looks neat in the Apex trigger handler, and the common logic across the object can be written in the base trigger handler, so we don't need to rewrite the code. Okay, this is the three main advantage. So for any future, if you guys are creating the trigger, you utilize the virtual trigger only, virtual extended trigger. We can also do one more method, interface extended trigger, but that's old, like that is very old. So we don't need to go with the interface extended trigger. There we need to implement the trigger handler. We will be defining the trigger handler as an interface, and a specific trigger handler object we will be implementing it. So let's not follow that approach. Let's go with the virtual and extending the virtual base trigger handler approach only. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we have 10 more minutes. I will be covering few other things also. So I hope everyone is installed. Okay, first thing is you guys need to use the Visual Studio Code. Don't use the developer console going forward. Okay, so strictly don't use the developer console. Everyone must use the Visual Studio Code. If you're having any issues in the system, you can use the code builder. That is online version of the Visual Studio Code. That is also having all the features. That is no different. Okay, that is the first thing. So the next thing is you need to use the Prettier. You need to install the Prettier and use it. You see, I installed the Prettier. Okay, Prettier is the plugin. I installed it. After installing, you need to run one command. Actually, this you need to do it for every workspace. Otherwise, it's not working. So installing one time, you just need to go to the extension and you need to install the Prettier. After that, you need to execute the one command that you need to do for all the projects separately. Okay, so that I will tell you. So if you go to this URL, I will share all these URLs. If you go to the Prettier and there is one command called this one, you need to run it. Otherwise, it will not work. So you need to run this command for every project workspace. If you are working on the two projects, then on both of the project you need to run this. And you need to make sure here the Prettier is showing with the tick. If it is showing the exclamatory symbol, it means there is some issue with the Prettier. If you click that, it will show the output panel, what is the issue, all those things you guys need to fix that. So when you use the Prettier, the SQL query and all will looks neat and it will apply indentation automatically. You can see SQL query, select keyword is in one line, from keyword is one line, where keyword is one line. So this is also mandatory. everyone must use the Visual Studio Code or Code filter. Everyone must use the Prettier configured with the Apex blocking. That is the next thing. Okay, so next we will quickly see about the best practice. For that also we have one extension called Code Analyzer. Okay, if you go to the Visual Studio and search for the Code Analyzer, okay, Salesforce Code Analyzer, you guys need to search. So I installed this already. So what it will do now, it will check for if our code is written with all the best practices, and it will check for all the security related issues. Okay, so let's see that in the action. So first you guys need to install that. So after installing, in this task manager class, let me do something. Also, this engine for developer also you guys can configure. So I know most of the time it can give wrong result also, but wherever it is helpful, you guys can use it. So this is how my code looks now. Let me deploy this source to Arc. So get very familiarized with this Visual Studio Code. It's really important. So we will cover the debugging also in the next session. So important. So after you write the development, after you write the code, and after you verify you covered all the logics, before you send the code review to the technical lead or the supervisor, you guys needs to make sure this code is with all the best practices. Okay. So what you need to do, you need to install the Code Analyzer extension, and you need to do the right click, and you need to do scan current file with the Code Analyzer. So it is scanning. Okay. Next, you need to go to the problem. So if you see there, it is showing 3 problems. One is missing Apex document comment, line number 1. So it's telling for the class, it is missing the comment. So comment is very important. So if new developer is coming, and they can easily see what this code is doing. Okay. So if you click on this link, it will also take you to the detailed link where you can see all the details. So you can see Apex doc comments are present for classes, method, properties that are public or global, excluding overrides and test classes. So for all this, we need to have the comment. So this tool validates for that. Okay, how to add the comment? If you come down, you can see the examples. So what it is telling, it needs to have the description of the class. And if there is any variable, we need to have the parameter also. It is for the methods. For the method, it needs to have the parameters. So it's not the normal comment. It needs to start with this defined one, this utter description. And if method is returning something, we need to write utter return, all those things. So let's see that in the action. So with the engine for developer, it makes easy. It can suggest also. Okay. So it is automatically suggesting like this, but I don't want this. We need to start with the utter description. Okay. So this description is also not good. So you guys need to write manually. Calculate the total spent effort for the task. Okay, it is fine. I don't want params here at the class level. Param needs to be there at the method level. So let me remove that. So for the class, just a description is enough. I added the description. So next for the method, we need description and also what is returning, and we also need to put the parameter. So it's automatically suggesting. I'm clicking the tab. Also, it is suggesting the return. So that also I'm putting the tab. Okay. So now we have the description, param, and return. All those things we are having. Anything is missing. So it needs to have the description. It needs to have the return. It needs to have the parameter. So now this line number 1 we fixed. Line number 2 also we fixed. Let's do. We need to clear it. So clear Code Analyzer isolation from the current file. So once you guys click that clear, then all those yellow lines will go away. After that, you need to again scan current file with the Code Analyzer. Okay, cool. So one error gone, but now it is showing the different error. Unexpected Apex doc return. So maybe return is only needed for where we are returning. Let's check. Apex documents on void or constructor method should not contain return. If method is void or constructor method, then we should not, that Apex comment should not contain the return. That's why this error is coming. So we added the return. So let me remove it. Since it is the void method, we don't need return. See, engine is suggesting wrongly. So AI is always not correct. Salesforce official document is correct. Okay. Now again, let me clear it. So you need to have the skill to tell whether AI is right or wrong. Okay, cool. So now if you see, this Apex comment error is gone for both the class and the method. So now we have the different thing at the line number 24. here only yellow lines are okay. I don't know whether it is yellow or gold. Okay, fine. So it's telling SQL query it's doing, but it's telling Apex C or UD violation. Let's see what it is. So it's telling for SQL we need to use the with security enforced. So let's add that. See, you should not go and blindly add this. So Apex comment is fine, but this you should not add like this. There can be scenario the user executing this code will not have access to this object or file. It can be run as guest user also. That time and all you should not use the security enforcer. Then your code will not work. It will work when you are running as admin. But when specific user is executing the code, it will not work. So the important thing is whenever you are creating any logic or any code or any functionality, you need to know who is going to use that feature. Okay. So most of the time I see this problem. It will work fine for admin user, but when it goes to the live, it will not work because you didn't think this feature will be used by this profiles or this kind of users. So you didn't give any access, or you enforced the extra restriction in the code. So those things should not happen. You are like when customer is telling the feature, if you don't know, you ask them for whom you want this feature. For some mark, there will be only one user. Okay, there it's fine. But in some mark, there will be many users with the different profiles. So that time and all, you guys need to ask clearly for which user you want this functionality. Okay. So if this code is going to be executed by the guest user or user who is not having the time sheet, but still we need to execute this code. For them, we should not use security enforcer, even though code analyzer is suggesting us. Okay, it varies based on the context and the use case. So here, I know you guys are going developers are you going to use this. Developer means in our company, developer is the use case for this use case, and the developer is having access for both time sheet and task record. So it's fine if we put security enforced. So let me clear the code analyzer and let me scan the current file. So it's running. Okay. So if you see scan completed, analyzed one file, 0 violation found. Okay, so now you are good to pass this code to review for the supervisor. Okay, so you guys need to use the Visual Studio Code. You need to use the Prettier. You need to use the Minimal Trigger Framework structure, and you need to use the Code Analyzer and Einstein for developers. So all these things are really important. You will see like how your productivity is going up, and you can use the time efficiently. Your code will look neat, and you can see the drastic change in the quality of the code and functionality is working. Okay, so I hope this session was useful. I am done with whatever I had for today. In the next session, I will try to take on the debugging, how to debug the Apex from the Visual Studio Code. That also we are not going to use the debug logs. We will be using from the Visual Studio Code only, that I will be explaining. End up with this session. Thank you so much.